الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر
In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the Creator and the Sustainer of the universe, peace and blessings upon His servant and messenger Muhammad forever. Ameen. I bear witness that there is no God worthy of worship except the God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger and slave servant of God. I greet you with the universal greetings of peace, the greetings that have been used by all of the prophets from Abraham to Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Assalamu-alaikum, which means peace be unto you. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid. Today in our Islam in Focus program, we start a new series dealing with moral teachings in Islam. Joining me as usual on the program is Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, Assalamu-alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Brother, we've just completed a 12-part series dealing with the pillars of Islam. I'm wondering if perhaps to keep the continuity between our last series dealing with pillars and the new series that we're about to embark on, if you perhaps could just explain the connection that exists between the previous series and the present series that we're going to be starting on today.
Okay. I think the significance of your question relate to the fact that many writers about Islam who are not totally familiar with Islam, when they speak of the so-called pillars of Islam or the 5 pillars of Islam, it is presented in such a way that that's the whole of Islam. Mm-hmm. What all Islam is about. And the point that we tried to make clear last time is that it took us 12 sessions just to even explore in some reasonable degree of depth, not really totally, the meaning and significance of each of the 5 pillars of Islam, believing in God, the performance of the 5 daily prayers and the various aspects relating to prayers more than just ritual, the poor due, the fasting, pilgrimage. But even then, the way these pillars of Islam relate to the present series is the fact that they represent the very bare minimum. Remember the example I gave in the very first program of that series, that when we talk about pillars of Islam, you're talking really about pillars. You're not talking about walls, ceiling, furniture, partitions. That doesn't constitute Islam, the 5 pillars in itself. It's the basis, bare minimum. Mm-hmm. So by the same token also, when you talk about human conduct relating to the ethical and moral values, requirements, things to be done or not to be done, they actually start basically with the 5 pillars of Islam as a basic training, as a foundation. But that's not all. Mm-hmm. Islam has its own ethical and moral system that covers all aspects of life independently of any other existing system, whether it's secular or religious. That's how actually it can be regarded as an elaboration more on the specifics of that subject.
Okay, moving into our program today then. To begin with, how would you define ethics and morals?
Well,
or how are ethics and morals defined?
I do not really wish to give too many academic definitions, but perhaps I'll just start with one and then I put it in a very simple term. But usually, ethics is defined as a study of human conduct as it relates to certain basic ideals. Mm-hmm. That's why ethics is regarded as a so-called normative science rather than a positive science. Normative in a sense of something that studies what ought to be. There must be some ideal, and this is what you're supposed to be doing. To put it in simpler terms, perhaps, we can also say that ethics and morals is a field of study that focus on the knowledge of good and bad, of good and evil. See? On what basis are we to evaluate some aspect of behavior as good or bad? This is in a very simplified form what ethics and morals is all about.
Hmm. Now, many people, I believe, today would raise the question as to whether or not discussion and consideration of ethical and moral factors has any relevance, given the advanced nature of our civilization and of our technology and so on. Are these ethical questions really relevant to day-to-day life?
Well, it is interesting to note, Brother Hamid, that from time immemorial, since mankind lived on this earth until nowadays, there was never a point where mankind ceased to contemplate and think about these basic moral questions of good and evil. Now, when people speak today about the so-called modern technology and civilization, space age, yes, definitely mankind did achieve great strides in these areas. But is that really the kind of progress or advancement in the total and complete sense that human beings are really aspiring to? In fact, when you look at it more closely, you will see that the relevance of this subject, or the relevance of moral and ethics, is so great that in one view at least, that all our present social, economic and political problems in fact lie into the moral problems. In other words, sometimes we could put our heads in the sand. We can ignore and say, oh, this moral and ethical stuff, forget about this old type of things. But indeed, this is a very superficial view, because at the heart of all of our contemporary problems is the basic ethical question. Just to give a few examples, when you talk today about technological advancement, how much did we advance in the human sense? What is happening to the institution of the family? Breaking down. You hear about group marriage and people cohabitate, living together without any bonds or any responsibility. Younger generation, and you hear about generation gap, antagonism and frustration, discontent that exists among the younger generation. Lack of sense of purpose. You talk about the disintegration of sexual morality, that evil became regarded as good and good is regarded as evil. Things have been lopsided, everything's put upside down now. All that in the name of progress and modernism. Honesty became for many people meaningless unless it pays. There must be some benefit that you derive from honesty. People who think that they are not worshipping any god because they are so-called liberated, they are indeed worshipping other false gods, the gods of wealth, power, expediency. Needless to go into the suffering that the world has gone through in 2 world wars and others, numerous other wars, where a great deal of cruelty has been done by man to his fellow man, to the point that one great philosopher, Bertrand Russell, at one point even said it probably would be unfair to beasts to say that man has descended to the level of beasts. Indeed, if I may add to that sometimes beasts are regarded as more humane, because when a beast kills, it kills for food, and that's it. But the senseless killing, the senseless murder, contemporary news this week, last month, you look any point of time, give us a very clear indication that we can no longer put our face in the sand and say, all right, let's look at technology and progress and forget about this old stuff of morality. If we have time, I could quote you a few examples of this. Which we have. There's a very nice little booklet here that we will be using quite effectively in this program. It's called Ethical Viewpoint of Islam by a great Pakistani scholar by the name of Maududi. It was written originally in Urdu, and the translator added a few useful editorial comments. I just selected 3 quotations, not by Muslims, by actually Western scholars reflecting their concern as to what is going on. For example, Lewis Mumford, in his book The Conduct of Life, says, or is talking about the invisible breakdown of our civilization, the erosion of values, dissipation of human purpose, the denial of distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, and reversion to subhuman levels of conduct. Harold Titus, in his book Living Issues in Philosophy, speaks there, and he talks about man. He says man was or has devised numerous plans and organizations for gaining greater security and comfort, yet he suffers from a mental and emotional security as to the meaning of life, the nature of the world in which he lives, and the kind of life he wants to live with his fellow men. An eloquent expression about the same kind of problem has been given by Northrop in his book The Meeting of East and West, in which he says it would seem that the more civilized we become, the more incapable of maintaining civilizations we are. So with this clear signals the relevance of the moral question is not simply important, but perhaps even more important than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were defining a few moments ago the meaning of ethics and morality, I think you mentioned that ethics and morality, the main concern of ethics and morality, has to do with the study of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if perhaps you could elaborate on this a little bit more, and perhaps you could indicate the major areas that are studied in ethics.
Well, I've got a very simple chart here that summarizes the very major questions. You notice here in that corner we have the main ethical questions that mankind has examined, and the answers, at least from the secular morality point of view at this point. And we'd say basically 4 questions are commonly found in books of philosophy and ethics. First of all, what is the supreme good? That is to say, what is the ultimate criterion or yardstick to judge something as good or evil? The ultimate good or goal of life, something that is worth living for. Second question, what are the sources of knowledge about good and evil? How do we know? Where do we derive this information? A third question is, who sanctions morality? What is the power that makes sure that people follow morality? What do? You force people, motivate them, appeal to them, what? And finally, a related question, what truly represents the motives of moral conduct? Aside from sanction, what causes people to follow a particular moral law? This is just in brief the headlines or the main issues.
Okay, could we now look at the other side of the coin and examine some of the answers to these questions?
Specifics?
You're right, the kinds of answers that are...
Okay. Well, if we refer to the chart again, we have listed here 3 major answers to the first question, what is the supreme good? I'll just go through the answers and then give some critique briefly. But one answer is that the ultimate thing is happiness. That is, anything that causes happiness, make people happy, that's good. Anything that makes them feel, sorry or sad or disappointed, then it's evil. A second answer or school is perfection. That is to say, the attainment of perfection, that human beings should be able to develop fully their capacity and their ability to achieve that level of perfection, and that's the criteria for good and evil. Anything that helps them in this development is good, the reverse is evil. A third suggestion was duty for the sake of duty. This is the idea presented by Immanuel Kant, one of the famous philosophers. which basically say that people really, or the ultimate good is to do good for this, or to do your duty for the sake of duty, not for any other purpose. If you really look at this type of answers, you find that all of them really belong to what we had here called as a secular morality.
Mm-hmm.
And what we mean by secular morality is the system of morality that is divorced from belief in God. In other words, it says that we can answer this question, we could, without necessarily believing in God or believing in the life hereafter. But if you look into each of these answers, you find that there are lots of conceptual problems. First of all, you talk about happiness as the ultimate good. But again, what do you mean by happiness? What type of happiness? Sensual? Spiritual? Mental? It doesn't answer it clearly. Not only this, whose happiness are we speaking about? The individual happiness? A group? Society? A nation? Or the happiness of mankind at large? So there's a great deal of ambiguity here. Moving on to the second answer, or the second school, perfection. What is the standard of perfection? How do we know? When you talk about perfection, you must have some standard in mind. How do you get that standard of perfection? What it is?
Mm-hmm.
Unclear. Similarly, like we said in happiness, whose perfection should we really strive at? Perfection of the individual, the group, society, nation, mankind? Duty for the sake of duty. That's perhaps one of the most ambiguous way of defining something that should really absolute and clear, supreme good. What exactly is the content? What does it mean to do your duty only for the sake of duty? Just like other slogans saying learning for the sake of learning. But even then, this is more ambiguous. And who laid it down? Who gave that clear definition of duty for the sake of duty? What's the rationale for people to do that duty?
Mm-hmm.
That's not totally clear either.
Looking at the second question, how do we know whether or not a given behavior is either good or bad? How is this question addressed by secular morality?
You mean in terms of what we call here in the chart the sources
of knowledge? Yes.
Well, similarly, we find the answers again under secular morality quite contradictory. You get all kind of answers. You know, there are piles of books of philosophy that give you all kind of rationale and explanation, which shows again the deficiency in the approach altogether. But one school is called empiricism. Well, that sounds like a big term. What it really means is that human experience should be regarded as the ultimate source of good and bad. Mm-hmm. So we as humans, we try, we learn. On the basis of that learning, we can find out what is good and what's evil. That's one. A second school is called intuitionism, coming from intuition, which means that human beings, by their nature, have some kind of insight. They have kind of feel for what is right and what's wrong. A third school is called rationalism, or I put it simply, reason. Many of the famous philosophers in the past, like Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, Hegel, were all basically in that school, rationalism. That is, we can discover good and evil by examining, using our reason to find out what really is good or evil. Now, again, this might sound interesting. Of course, it may have some gem of truth into it. But let's look at it more critically. When we say experience as a source of what is good or what is bad, now, whose experience are we talking about? If you're talking about universal human experience, it means that you've got to have full data on experience before you can really come up with an answer. But even when you evaluate human experience to come up with your conclusions, you run into lots of problems. Because ideally you should get someone who not only have access to the full data, but who is very level-minded, who's very objective, that he would not be biased in his interpretation. And that's impossible. because you get any number of experts and everybody would interpret human experience depending on his own field of study or competence. You can't get a universal agreement, and if you don't get universal agreement, then you're talking about relativism, that everything becomes relative. You're not talking about absolute and final source of good and evil. The other problem also that when you talk about experience, that means perhaps you have to wait for too long until you have this full data. See? That means you let people be lost for centuries without finding a clear, crystallized answer to their questions because simply you haven't got the data. Both other schools, intuition and reason, both of them perhaps may be partial source, just like experience, of judging what is good and what is evil. But again, they are only partial. They're in themselves insufficient. Intuition, as we described in previous programs also, is not necessarily totally accurate. It's biased sometimes. Reasoning also might be biased. There could be all kind of problems that arise. So we are left here again in the second question, bewildered, not really knowing exactly how to find a final answer for that question.
Okay, could we move on then and look at the question of sanctions? According to the secular scheme of things, what do the various schools think about this question of who sanctions morality?
Well, first of all, one school, I just put that as self-enforcing, that they claim that the main sanction for morality is basically the nature of morality itself, that automatically it sanctions itself. So there's some happiness that you derive when you do the right thing. There's some bad feeling when you do something wrong, just like happiness or perfection that we talked about before, the same kind of theme. So virtue itself leads to enforcement. Virtue itself is self-enforcing, if you will. Another is the so-called the law of practical reason. That is, there is a kind of self-imposed law that following morality is practical. So in other words, it imposes itself, it enforces itself. In a way, it's similar again to self-enforcing, just a kind of another angle of looking at it. And then some also claim that it is the political power in any particular society that sanction morality. They force you. They've got the power. They got the police, the jails, and everything. So they say you do it or else. So that's it. Others would say it's not exactly political power, but maybe you can also speak of informal social pressure. That society, in any particular society, there are certain norms of the do's and don'ts. People are pressured to follow those norms, and that's how people are forced or in a way prodded to follow and respect the moral law.
Question number 4 and question number 3 on your chart, I think, are closely related, if not interrelated. Mm-hmm. And this question of the motive of moral conduct. Perhaps you could explain how the various schools of thought look at this under the secular morality.
Okay. They are related, but of course we separated them because here you're talking really about who has the right to enforce morality, and here we're simply talking about what really causes people internally or motivates them internally to follow morality. One claim is that people have an inherent, inborn respect of the law. Of course, those who said that perhaps were not aware with the further development that is taking place in the last 2 decades. What kind of respect of law you get. Others claim that it is simply the desire for perfection, that people try their best to achieve a high level of perfection, and that motivation itself, it's an inborn, again, attitude or inclination to try to be perfect, as much as humanly possible, of course. A third school, or amalgam of schools really, because they're all kind of using that, can be summarized actually in 2 words: punishment and reward. That is, people follow morality simply because if they don't, they're subject to some kind of punishment, and if they follow the moral code or moral law, they are given certain rewards.
But the schools vary as to who gives that reward, which reward is more important in the mind of the individual. One claim is that it's basically a reward by the state. So that would be the counterpart here of the political power in sanction. Okay? The others say that it's basically reward and punishment by society. That's the counterpart of social pressure, which means socially you're punished by what? Being ostracized, being rejected in society, or you're rewarded also by society by being accepted, respected and all that. But it mainly relates to this basic utilitarian type of attitude that something benefits me, that causes me to follow or harm me so that I avoid doing it. As you notice, by the way, in both of these, just like we're talking also about the first two questions, when you talk about sanctions or motives, you're back in square one. You're in the same problem again. Sanctions and motives with respect to individual, group, society, mankind at large. You're left still in confusion on the basis of secular morality.
Well, this chart that we've been discussing and the main questions and the answers and so on that are provided by the various schools of thought in secular morality is very helpful in terms of getting an understanding. Would it be reasonable to conclude, or let me ask for another way, the weaknesses that we've discussed here today in today's program in secular morality? Could we infer from this, or could it be implied from this that the secular moral thinking is really completely unreliable and is completely devoid of any kind of truth or utility?
Well, I've got to be fair on that. Of course, I have been critical in many respects. But, of course, to be fair, one cannot say that any of those ideas that represent the fruits of human thought and great efforts of many philosophers throughout history is all devoid of any truth. If you recall, even in one point I mentioned that there might be some gems of truth in each of these. But there is a big problem with them, that most of these points might represent partial aspects of understanding basis of ethics and morality. Partial. So their main problem is that when you don't have a complete and comprehensive system of ethics and morality, you're left with a situation where there are so many gaps and so many unanswered questions. In that kind of situation, you find many philosophers or many thinkers try to fill those gaps. They don't fill it necessarily with something that's solid. Sometimes it's just their own assumptions, imaginations, which may or may not help resolve these problems. The other point again is that even though there have been some attempts, laudable efforts, I should say, to answer some of these questions, we don't really get a clear indication as to how could you use these foundations of morality or answers to these four questions as a foundation and a basis upon which you could build simultaneously an individual who is righteous and a society also that's righteous, without getting to one extreme or the other, without being too totalitarian or just laissez-faire or just open type of loose system where there is no social control. This does not necessarily stem from this kind of thinking. But above all, and perhaps this is the most crucial critique, I should say, for this whole notion of secular morality, regardless of the various schools of thought and the various ways the question is answered. And that is, it establishes or attempts to establish a moral system as if mankind is independent of God, to divorce the discussion of morality from believing in God and in the hereafter.
Thank you, Brother Jamal. In our program today, our introductory program on moral teachings of Islam, we've been examining critically, analyzing many of the main questions and answers that are implicit in the study of secular morality. We want to invite you back next week when we'll continue our second program in this series on moral teachings of Islam, and we'll take another look at morality, religious morality. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.